June 1944. A brutal war rages across the Pacific. Under the sweltering midday sun, a young Japanese soldier finds himself standing in an American prison camp thousands of miles from home. Days ago, he was prepared to die for the Emperor on a remote island battlefield. Instead, he regained consciousness as a captive, alive but terrified. He had been taught that surrender was a fate worse than death. His superiors drilled into him that the enemy would torture and kill any Japanese who gave up. Now, heart-pounding, he expects the worst from his captors. Inside the camp mess hall, he braces for brutality, but is met with an astonishing sight. An American guard hands him a metal tray piled high with unfamiliar yet delicious-smelling food. He stares down at it in disbelief. A thick hamburger with a soft white bun, a mound of golden potato fries, and even an ice-cold bottle of Coca-Cola sweating in the heat. The aroma of grilled meat and the sugary fizz of soda are nothing like anything he experienced as a soldier. Just weeks earlier, he and his comrades were starving on slim rations, a handful of rice, maybe some muddy water or boiled grass. In desperation, they had choked down insects and even chewed on leather straps to stay alive. Yet here, in the heart of enemy territory, he is being offered a meal fit for a king. The Japanese man's hands tremble as he holds the tray. Could this be a trick? Around him, dozens of other captured Japanese soldiers are similarly frozen in place, eyeing their food with suspicion and wonder. Some clench their fists, recalling horror stories of poison or traps. One mutters under his breath, refusing to take a bite. They had all heard ghastly propaganda that Americans were cruel and heartless. Many truly believed that capture would lead to torture and execution. In fact, later interrogations would reveal that about 84% of Japanese soldiers captured expected to be killed by the Americans rather than fed. The fear that this kind treatment is just a cruel prelude to punishment weighs on them. Finally, hunger and curiosity overcome fear. The young soldier lifts the hamburger to his lips. He has not tasted beef in years, if ever. He takes a cautious bite. The bread is soft and slightly sweet, the juicy meat seasoned and rich, flavors overwhelming his senses. He chews slowly, eyes widening. It tastes unbelievably good. Encouraged by his reaction, others start eating too. Within moments, starving men are devouring the feast. Some cough as they gulp down the strange sweet cola, unaccustomed to the tickle of carbonation and the rush of sugar. Tentative chuckles rise from one table, disbelief turning into relieved laughter. The sight is almost surreal. Moments ago, these were hardened warriors prepared to die in battle. And now they sit in an American mess hall wolfing down hamburgers and sodas like carefree teenagers. bread or meat from their trays, hiding leftovers in their pockets or under their mattresses, fearing that the generous rations might be taken away or reduced later. It seems impossible that this abundance will continue, but it does. The American camp commanders have orders to keep the prisoners healthy. Each captive is allotted around 2,000 to 2,500 calories of food a day, depending on whether he works, with even more for those doing hard labor. The camp cooks even adjust the menus to suit Japanese tastes, providing rice frequently and fresh vegetables when they can. The intent is clear. These men may be enemies, but they will be treated as human beings. Along with food, the Americans provide medical care that leaves the Japanese astonished. When this young soldier was captured, he had a shrapnel wound in his shoulder and a fever from infection. He fully expected to die anonymously or be executed, but instead the Americans bandaged him and gave him medicine. In the camp, infirmary doctors, the same enemy he had been firing at days before, examine him gently and even vaccinate him against diseases. Many of the prisoners have their first proper dental checkups and treatments for ailments that had plagued them in the field. They quickly realize that they are receiving the same medical attention that American troops get. To these men, who in their own army often went without any medical aid, such care is almost unbelievable. Some find it deeply humiliating to be tended by the enemy doctors. Others are quietly grateful to finally be treated as valued lives. As their bellies fill and their wounds heal, the Japanese prisoners start to see that life in the American camp is far from the nightmare they imagined. In truth, it feels more like an odd kind of paradise compared to the battlefields they left behind. The camp is surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, of course. But within those bounds, the men find small freedoms. They are issued clean uniforms with bold letters identifying them as prisoners. They sleep in sturdy barracks instead of foxholes, and they have regular schedules. At first, many lie awake at night, unable to believe they are safe. They wonder if this is all temporary, if any day now the Americans will turn cruel. But each morning brings more evidence that their captors intend to follow the rules. Reveille sounds, the prisoners eat a hot breakfast, and the day routine begins. To occupy the men and maintain discipline, the camp authorities assign light work duties and offer recreation. The Japanese spend hours doing tasks like cleaning the grounds, repairing buildings, or tending vegetable gardens. Unlike in their own army, where grueling labor was forced upon them, here the work is modest and often relatively easy. In their free time, they can play sports or engage in hobbies. The Americans encourage baseball games, knowing that the Japanese are familiar with the sport from before the war. Soon one can see former enemies laughing together over a friendly baseball or volleyball match inside the compound. Some prisoners practice judo and put on sparring demonstrations, even teaching curious American guards a few moves. Others take to quieter activities, sketching, painting, or writing. A camp newspaper is started, with prisoners contributing articles and artwork about their daily life. The simple act of publishing a newsletter, under the eye of camp censors, gives these men a sense of normalcy and dignity. It is a far cry from the dehumanizing experience they expected. Perhaps the most astonishing luxury for the Japanese prisoners is the access to items and entertainment that even many American civilians lack during wartime. The camp has a post-exchange, a small canteen store, where prisoners can use the tiny wages they earn from camp labor to buy treats. To their amazement, they find that for a few cents, they can purchase things like Hershey chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, or even a bottle of beer. These are items they scarcely saw as soldiers, And back in Japan, such luxuries have become virtually non-existent due to severe wartime shortages. In fact, the United States is rationing many goods like sugar and meat for its own civilians. Yet here, enemy prisoners are given access to candy and soft drinks. The irony is not lost on anyone. Enemy prisoners in this camp are enjoying consumer goods that many American citizens cannot easily get in wartime. Some guards privately grumble at how their prisoners can buy chocolate bars when their own families back home struggle to find any. But the rules are the rules, and the United States military upholds them. On weekends, the camp even provides organized entertainment. At the large camp in Wisconsin where our young soldier is held, the officers arrange occasional movie nights. A few times each month, groups of Japanese prisoners under guard are escorted to a local movie theater in town for a private screening. They sit quietly in the dark, watching American newsreels or even Hollywood films. Some of it is blatant war propaganda that makes them shift uncomfortably in their seats. It is bizarre to watch Hollywood heroes mowing down enemy Japanese on screen, knowing they themselves are Japanese soldiers in United States custody. Still, the mere experience of going to a theater, eating popcorn, and seeing a movie is completely surreal to them. It is a brief escape from the reality of being prisoners. Back at camp, the Americans also allow them to put on plays and music shows. The prisoners form small bands with whatever instruments they can find. One evening, a group of Japanese men strum improvised guitars and sing songs from home, drawing tears as others softly join in chorus. The American guards, listening from a distance, are struck by the poignancy of it. Just months prior, these voices were screaming war cries, and now they carry melodies of longing and sorrow. Religious and cultural needs are not ignored either. The Japanese prisoners are permitted to build little rock gardens and even erect a small Buddhist shrine in a corner of the camp yard. Killed shortly after surrendering on the battlefield before cooler heads prevailed. The war in the Pacific has been vicious, and there is bitterness on both sides. Knowing this, the Japanese prisoners are actually relieved to be where they are, inside a regulated camp protected by rules, rather than at the mercy of a furious platoon on some jungle island. They keep their heads down and behave, hoping not to provoke any guard who might be looking for an excuse to retaliate. For the most part, however, the Americans running the camp maintain professional discipline. The prisoners are astonished at how strictly the United States military adheres to regulations about their treatment. There is no random cruelty, no beatings, none of the abuse they initially feared. There is also a shrewd strategy behind this kindness. American military leaders know that if Japanese troops in the field learn how well their captured comrades are treated, they might be more willing to surrender instead of fighting to the bitter end. To spread the word, the United States drops leaflets and makes radio broadcasts promising good treatment, even featuring statements from Japanese soldiers who laid down arms and lived to tell about it. Each well-cared-for captive here is living proof of these promises. The hope is that such humane treatment will weaken the enemy resolve and ultimately save lives by shortening the war. In fact, some Japanese feel a pang of shame when they remember how differently Imperial Japanese forces treated Allied prisoners. Stories of the Bataan Death March and other atrocities have reached even these men. They know that had the roles been reversed, their enemies would likely be suffering greatly. The contrast is not lost on them. Some older soldiers bow their heads, feeling a grim humility at this reality. Camp authorities are aware of these simmering feelings of disgrace. They quietly take precautions against any man trying to take his own life. Sharp objects like razors are kept out of reach, and guards discreetly watch for signs of despair. Thankfully, such tragedies remain rare. Only one Japanese captive at this camp succeeds in ending his life during the war. The rest, despite their shame, choose to endure and live on day by day. Here they are well fed and cared for, while their comrades still fighting in the Pacific jungles continue to starve and suffer. Back in Japan, the families of these captured soldiers have no idea of the relatively comfortable life their sons are living behind barbed wire. Japanese authorities, following the Bushido Code of Honor, often report captured soldiers as killed in action. Many of the prisoners themselves choose not to write home even when given the opportunity via the Red Cross. They feel too ashamed. They would rather their parents think them dead as fallen heroes than know the truth that they surrendered. Some know that even if they were to send a letter, their family might receive a notice of death from the military before the truth of their capture ever reaches them. And so, in the eyes of those back home, these men no longer exist. This only adds to the sense that life in the American camp is a strange limbo, a world between war and peace, between life and death. For these soldiers, the war is over, yet they are not truly free. Here they remain, well-fed and safe, while uncertainty hangs over their future. By August 1945, the tide of war turns decisively. The United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan finally surrenders. The prisoners in the American camps receive the news with mixed emotions. They are jubilant that the war is over and that Japan nightmare will end. Some cheer, feeling vindicated that the militarist regime that led them into catastrophe has fallen. Others hang their heads, mourning their nation defeat and wondering what fate awaits them now. Soon they learn they will be going home. Repatriation ships are arranged, and the Japanese men who have lived in the camp for a year or more prepare to return across the ocean. They are given back their old uniforms or provided civilian clothes, and then they are escorted to ports and loaded onto vessels bound for a shattered homeland. In their bags, some carry unusual souvenirs, baseball gloves and English phrasebooks given by the Americans, empty Coke bottles or candy wrappers as mementos of the surreal time when they, the defeated, were pampered by the victors. When these former prisoners set foot again on Japanese soil, they are almost unrecognizable to those at home. They appear healthy and well-fed, in stark contrast to the gaunt, sickly survivors of battles and bombings who are also trickling home. Many families and neighbors are stunned to see men who were thought dead arriving with rosy cheeks and even a bit of weight gained. But the returnees carry heavy burdens in their hearts. They know that many of their countrymen consider them dishonorable for having been captured instead of dying in battle. In the years to come, some of these repatriated men struggle to explain their survival. A few hide the fact that they were prisoners at all, giving other reasons for their long absence. Others, however, quietly tell the truth of what they experienced in America. They speak of the hamburgers and Coca-Cola, of the doctors and baseball games, of how the Americans treated them with a humanity they did not expect. These stories seem almost unbelievable to listeners in a devastated Japan, where memories of brutal enemy air raids and rigid propaganda are still fresh. Over time, however, such accounts become part of the collective understanding. They show that even in the darkest days of war, compassion could arise in the most unlikely places. The broader context of Japanese prisoner treatment. The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war by American forces during World War II represents a complex intersection of military policy, international law, cultural differences, and wartime propaganda. The experience described above was not isolated, but part of a systematic approach by the United States military to adhere to international culture that emphasized death before dishonor and portrayed capture as the ultimate disgrace. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated with the belief that surrender was equivalent to betrayal of the emperor, their families, and the nation. Many chose suicide rather than capture, and some fought to the last man in hopeless situations rather than lay down their arms. Despite these cultural factors, tens of thousands of Japanese military personnel did become prisoners of American forces during the war. Early in the conflict, very few Japanese soldiers surrendered. At Guadalcanal, only about 1,000 Japanese prisoners were taken out of a force of over 3,000. At Tarawa, only 17 Japanese combatants were captured alive out of a garrison of nearly 5,000. However, as the war progressed and American forces advanced closer to the Japanese home islands, the number of prisoners increased significantly. By the end of the war, American forces held over 4,000 Japanese prisoners in camps located primarily in the United States, Hawaii, and other Pacific territories. The low surrender rate created challenges for American intelligence operations, as prisoners were valuable sources of information about Japanese military capabilities, troop movements, and strategic plans. The relatively small number of prisoners available for interrogation made each captive especially important from an intelligence perspective. This was another factor that motivated the American military to treat prisoners well. Cooperative prisoners provided better intelligence, and knowledge that prisoners were treated humanely might encourage others to surrender. Camp locations and organization. Japanese prisoners of war were held in various locations depending on when and where they were captured. Initial processing typically occurred at temporary facilities near the battlefield, where prisoners received medical treatment, were interrogated, and underwent initial classification. From these forward locations, prisoners were then transferred to more permanent facilities. Many Japanese prisoners captured in the Pacific Theater were eventually transferred to camps within the continental United States. This served multiple purposes. It removed them from potential rescue or the chaos of active combat zones. It protected them from possible retaliation by Allied troops or civilians who had suffered in the Pacific War, and it provided secure locations where they could be held for the duration of the conflict. Major prisoner of war camps housing Japanese captives were established in states including Wisconsin, Texas, Arkansas, Montana, and several other locations far from the Pacific coast. The decision to locate camps in interior states was deliberate. The West Coast had large populations of Japanese Americans, many of whom were themselves interned in separate facilities during the war. There was concern that housing Japanese prisoners of war near these populations might create confusion or complications. Additionally, anti-Japanese sentiment was particularly strong on the West Coast, given its proximity to the Pacific Theater, and military planners worried about the safety of prisoners if they were held there. Camp facilities varied in size and configuration, but generally followed similar organizational principles. They were typically surrounded by barbed wire fencing with guard towers at regular intervals. Inside the perimeter, prisoners were housed in wooden barracks that provided basic shelter from the elements. Larger camps had multiple compounds that could be used to separate different groups of prisoners if necessary. Facilities included mess halls, medical infirmaries, recreation areas, workshops, and administrative buildings. Daily life and routines. The daily routine in American prisoner of war camps was structured and predictable. Prisoners were awakened at a fixed time each morning, typically around 6 in the morning. After rising, they had time for personal hygiene before breakfast was served. Meals were provided 3 times daily at regular intervals. Between meals, prisoners engaged in various activities, including assigned work details, recreation, educational programs, and personal time. Work assignments were a central feature of camp life. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work, and the American military utilized prisoner labor for various tasks. These included agricultural work, such as tending crops and harvesting, maintenance of camp facilities, construction projects, and production of goods. The work was generally not directly related to the war effort, as this would have violated international law. Prisoners who worked received small wages that they could use at the camp canteen to purchase items like cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. The amount of work required was reasonable by most standards, especially when compared to the harsh labor conditions many of these men had experienced in the Japanese military, or that Allied prisoners experienced in Japanese captivity. Workdays were limited in hours, and prisoners received adequate rest periods and days off. Those who were sick or injured were excused from work duties until they recovered. Recreation time was abundant in American prisoner of war camps. The military authorities recognized that keeping prisoners occupied with positive activities would maintain morale and reduce disciplinary problems. Sports were particularly emphasized. Baseball was popular because many Japanese soldiers had played the game before the war, as it had been introduced to Japan decades earlier and was widely enjoyed there. Volleyball, basketball, and track and field activities were also common. Some camps organized tournaments and competitions between different barracks or groups. Beyond sports, prisoners engaged in various hobbies and cultural activities. Those with artistic talents created paintings, drawings, and sculptures. Materials were provided or could be purchased at the canteen. Some prisoners made handicrafts such as carved wooden objects, woven items, and decorative pieces. These creations served as gifts for fellow prisoners or were kept as personal mementos. A few camps even organized exhibitions where prisoners could display their artistic work. Educational opportunities problems were common among the prisoners, as preventive dental care had been virtually non-existent in the Japanese military. American dentists examined prisoners' teeth, performed extractions when necessary, filled cavities, and provided other basic dental services. For many prisoners, this was their first encounter with modern dentistry. The quality of medical care extended to the treatment of mental health issues as well. Camp authorities were aware that many prisoners suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety related to their combat experiences and the shame of capture. While formal psychiatric treatment was limited by the standards of the era, medical staff did provide counseling and support to prisoners struggling with emotional difficulties. The emphasis on maintaining regular routines, providing recreational opportunities, and allowing cultural practices all served mental health purposes. Hospital facilities for more serious medical cases were available at larger camps or at nearby military medical centers. Prisoners requiring surgery or specialized treatment were transferred to these facilities, where they received care equivalent to that provided to American military personnel. There are documented cases of Japanese prisoners receiving complex surgical procedures, extended hospital stays, and sophisticated medical interventions that saved their lives or preserved their health. Food and nutrition. The food provided to Japanese prisoners in American camps exceeded minimum nutritional requirements and often surpassed what prisoners had eaten as soldiers in the Japanese military. American authorities took seriously their obligation under the Geneva Convention to provide adequate nutrition to prisoners, and the abundance of American agricultural production made this feasible even during wartime. Menus in prisoner of war camps were designed to provide balanced nutrition with adequate calories, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. The typical daily ration for a prisoner included meat, bread, vegetables, and fruit, supplemented with rice when available. Breakfast might consist of eggs, bacon, toast, cereal, and coffee or tea. Lunch and dinner featured main courses such as beef, pork, or chicken, along with side dishes of potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Portion sizes were generous, and seconds were often available. Efforts were made to accommodate Japanese food preferences and tastes. Rice was provided regularly, as it was a dietary staple for Japanese people. Camp cooks learned to prepare rice properly and included it as an alternative to potatoes or bread. Other foods familiar to Japanese palates, such as fish, soy sauce, pickled vegetables, and miso soup, were introduced to menus when ingredients were available. On Japanese holidays and festivals, special meals were prepared that included traditional foods associated with those occasions. The contrast between camp food and what prisoners had experienced in the Japanese military was dramatic. Japanese soldiers in the field often subsisted on minimal rations of rice supplemented with whatever could be foraged or captured. Supply lines were frequently disrupted, and many units suffered from severe food shortages. Protein was scarce, and many Japanese soldiers developed malnutrition-related illnesses, such as beriberi caused by vitamin B deficiency. In comparison, the variety and abundance of food in American camps seemed almost unbelievable to the prisoners. Some prisoners initially struggled with the American diet. The high fat content and rich flavors were unfamiliar to digestive systems accustomed to much simpler fare. Dairy products, which were uncommon in traditional Japanese diets, sometimes caused digestive upset. Over time, however, most prisoners adjusted to the food, and many gained considerable weight during their captivity, arriving home healthier than when they had been captured. The canteen system. The post-exchange or canteen system in American prisoner of war camps allowed prisoners to purchase various items with the wages they earned from work details. This system served multiple purposes. It provided incentive for prisoners to work, gave them access to small luxuries that improved morale, and created a sense of normalcy through the ability to make personal choices about purchases. Canteens stocked a variety of goods, including cigarettes and tobacco products, candy and chocolate, chewing gum, soft drinks, beer in some cases, toiletries such as soap and toothpaste, writing materials, magazines and books, and miscellaneous items like playing cards and simple games. Prices were set at levels that made these items affordable on prisoner wages, which were typically a few cents per day depending on the type of work performed. The availability of American consumer goods to enemy prisoners while American civilians faced rationing created some controversy. Items like chocolate, sugar, and cigarettes were rationed on the home front, yet prisoners had access to them in camp canteens. This situation did not sit well with some Americans who felt that enemy prisoners were being treated too generously while American families made sacrifices. However, military authorities maintained that adherence to the Geneva Convention required these provisions, and that treating prisoners well served strategic purposes. For the Japanese prisoners, the canteen represented something almost magical. Many had never seen such abundance of consumer goods. In wartime Japan, severe shortages meant that luxuries like chocolate and soft drinks were completely unavailable to ordinary people and even to most soldiers. The ability to walk into a canteen and purchase a candy bar or a cold drink with money earned from light work seemed incomprehensible given the deprivation they had known. Cultural and religious accommodation. American camp authorities demonstrated surprising flexibility in accommodating the cultural and religious practices of Japanese prisoners. This accommodation went beyond the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention and reflected a recognition that allowing prisoners to maintain connections to their culture exchange where prisoners traded artwork for additional privileges or goods. The creation and maintenance of Japanese-style gardens in some camps represented another form of cultural accommodation. Prisoners designed and tended small landscape gardens using rocks, plants, and water features arranged according to traditional aesthetic principles. These gardens provided peaceful spaces for contemplation and reminded prisoners of home. For men far from their homeland facing an uncertain future, the ability to create something beautiful and culturally meaningful had profound psychological importance. Recreation and entertainment. The range of recreational and entertainment opportunities available to Japanese prisoners in American camps was extensive and would have been unimaginable to most of them, based on their expectations of captivity. Beyond the sports activities already mentioned, prisoners had access to various forms of entertainment that helped pass the time and maintained morale. Movie screenings were among the most popular forms of entertainment. Several times each month, prisoners were shown films that ranged from Hollywood features to documentaries and newsreels. The content of these screenings was carefully selected. War propaganda films depicting American victories and Japanese defeats were shown partly to reinforce the reality of Allied success, though these could be uncomfortable viewing for the prisoners. Hollywood entertainment films provided escapism and exposure to American culture. Some prisoners became fans of American movie stars and enjoyed discussing the films they had seen. Live theatrical performances represented another important entertainment category. Prisoners with theatrical experience organized dramatic productions using scripts they created or adapted. These plays ranged from traditional Japanese dramas to contemporary stories and comedic sketches. Performances provided entertainment for the entire camp population and gave talented prisoners an outlet for creative expression. Some camps constructed simple stages and provided basic theatrical supplies such as curtains, props, and costume materials. Musical activities flourished in the camps. Many prisoners had musical ability and formed small bands or ensembles. Instruments were scarce initially, but some were provided through the Red Cross or fashioned by prisoners from available materials. Traditional Japanese instruments were rare, but prisoners adapted to Western instruments such as guitars, harmonicas, and drums. Musical performances ranged from traditional Japanese songs that evoked nostalgia for home to Western popular music that prisoners learned during their captivity. Music provided emotional release and created moments of shared experience that temporarily transcended the reality of imprisonment. Camp newspapers and magazines emerged in several facilities. These publications contained articles written by prisoners about camp life, creative writing including poetry and short stories, artwork and illustrations, news summaries from approved sources, and puzzles and games. The newspapers were subject to censorship by camp authorities, who reviewed content to ensure it did not contain material that might undermine security or promote unrest. Despite this limitation, the publications gave prisoners a voice and created a sense of community identity. Labor and economic activities. The work performed by Japanese prisoners in American camps served multiple purposes beyond simply keeping the men occupied. Prisoner labor contributed to agricultural production, camp maintenance, and various light industrial activities, while providing prisoners with small wages that they could use for purchases at the canteen. Agricultural work was among the most common labor assignments. Many camps were located in rural areas with access to farmland, and prisoners were put to work planting, tending, and harvesting crops. They grew vegetables, fruits, and other agricultural products that supplied not only the camp itself, but sometimes the broader military food supply chain. Some prisoners with farming backgrounds found this work familiar and satisfying, as it connected them to the agricultural traditions of rural Japan. Maintenance tasks kept camps functioning properly. Prisoners performed cleaning duties, building repairs, groundskeeping, and various infrastructure maintenance activities. These jobs were essential for maintaining sanitary conditions and preventing the deterioration of facilities. Some prisoners learned new skills in carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and other trades through these assignments. Light manufacturing and craft production occurred in some camps. Prisoners made items such as camouflage nets, simple wooden products, repaired equipment, and produced other goods that were useful but not directly related to weapons or ammunition production. These activities taught prisoners new skills and kept them productively occupied. The prohibition against using prisoner labor for direct war support was strictly observed in accordance with Geneva Convention requirements. Wages for prisoner work were modest but meaningful in the context of the camp economy. Prisoners typically earned between 10 and 80 cents per day, depending on the type and difficulty of work performed. While these amounts seem tiny by any standard, they were sufficient to allow regular purchases at the camp canteen. Some prisoners saved their earnings over time to accumulate enough for larger purchases or to have funds available upon their eventual release or repatriation. Psychological impact and adjustment. The psychological experience of Japanese prisoners in American camps was complex and often contradictory. The contrast between their expectations of torture and death versus the reality of good treatment created cognitive dissonance that prisoners had to process and reconcile. This adjustment occurred gradually and differently for each individual. Initial shock and disbelief characterized the first days and weeks of captivity. Prisoners could not quite believe that they were being treated well and constantly expected conditions to deteriorate. Many remained suspicious of American motives. wondering if the good treatment was temporary or part of some elaborate psychological manipulation. And when necessary, counseling from medical personnel. Adaptation and resilience characterized many prisoners over time. Human beings are remarkably capable of adjusting to new circumstances, and most prisoners eventually adapted to camp life. They formed friendships with fellow prisoners, developed routines that gave structure to their days, and found meaning in small activities and accomplishments. Some even described their time in American captivity as a period of personal growth, during which they learned new skills, gained broader perspectives, and developed different understandings of themselves and the world. A minority of prisoners actively resisted accepting their situation. These individuals maintained aggressive attitudes, refused to cooperate beyond minimum requirements, and encouraged others to remain hostile to their captors. Camp authorities identified these troublemakers and sometimes segregated them from the general prison population to prevent them from undermining camp order. However, such cases were relatively rare, as most prisoners recognized that cooperation made their lives easier and resistance served no purpose. Intelligence gathering and interrogation. From an American military perspective, Japanese prisoners represented valuable sources of intelligence about enemy forces, capabilities, and intentions. The interrogation of prisoners was conducted systematically and with increasing sophistication as the war progressed. American intelligence officers developed techniques specifically tailored to overcome the cultural and psychological barriers that made Japanese prisoners particularly difficult to interrogate. Initial interrogations typically occurred shortly after capture, when prisoners were still disoriented and vulnerable. Interrogators used this psychological state to extract basic information such as unit identification, troop strengths, and recent military activities. However, deeply ingrained loyalty to the emperor and shame about surrender made many prisoners reluctant to provide information they perceived as betraying their country. American interrogators learned that harsh treatment was counterproductive with Japanese prisoners. Violence or threats only reinforced the propaganda these men had been taught about American brutality and made them less likely to cooperate. Instead, interrogators found that kindness and respect were far more effective. Offering food, medical care, and reassurance that the prisoner would be treated humanely often opened channels of communication that threats never could. Some Japanese prisoners proved surprisingly willing to provide detailed information once they overcame initial resistance. Having violated the code against surrender, some prisoners felt they had already crossed a moral boundary and saw no additional dishonor in answering questions. Others rationalized their cooperation by reasoning that the information they provided might actually help end the war sooner and save lives. A few became so cooperative that they volunteered to participate in American propaganda efforts, making radio broadcasts or writing leaflets encouraging other Japanese soldiers to surrender. The intelligence gained from prisoner interrogations proved valuable in multiple ways. Strategic information about Japanese military organization, equipment, and tactics helped American commanders plan operations. Tactical intelligence about specific units, defensive positions, and troop movements provided advantages in ongoing battles. Information about morale conditions among Japanese forces helped psychological warfare experts craft more effective propaganda. Even seemingly mundane details about daily life in Japanese military units helped American planners better understand their enemy. Special interrogation facilities were established to process high-value prisoners who possessed particularly important information. Senior officers, technical specialists, and personnel from elite units received intensive interrogation by experienced intelligence officers who understood the nuances of Japanese military culture and hierarchy. These interrogations could last days or weeks and employed sophisticated psychological techniques to elicit cooperation. The Takam information environment within camps was carefully managed to facilitate intelligence gathering. Camp authorities monitored prisoner mail, observed conversations between prisoners, and noted the formation of social groups and hierarchies within the prisoner population. Prisoners who demonstrated leadership qualities or held influential positions among their fellows were identified and sometimes cultivated as informants or collaborators. This internal intelligence network helped camp administrators maintain control and occasionally yielded useful military intelligence. Propaganda and psychological operations. The treatment of Japanese prisoners was not only about humanitarian concerns and legal obligations. It was also a deliberate component of American psychological warfare strategy in the Pacific. Military planners recognized that demonstrating humane treatment of prisoners could weaken enemy resistance and potentially save American lives by encouraging more Japanese soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions described the good treatment awaiting those who surrendered. These leaflets often included testimonials from actual prisoners describing their experiences in American custody. Photographs showed prisoners eating good food, receiving medical care, and engaging in recreational activities. The message was clear. Surrender does not mean death or torture, but safety and reasonable treatment. Radio broadcasts from American propaganda stations featured interviews with cooperative prisoners who spoke about their positive experiences in captivity. These broadcasts were beamed toward Japanese forces in combat zones and even toward the Japanese home islands. The prisoners speaking on these broadcasts described their surprise at the kind treatment they received and urged their former comrades to lay down their arms. While the effectiveness of this propaganda is difficult to measure, American psychological warfare experts believed it had some impact, particularly as the war situation rather than in conflict. Treating prisoners well was simultaneously the right thing to do morally, required by international law, and advantageous from a military standpoint. This confluence of factors helps explain why the United States maintained high standards of prisoner treatment, despite the brutal nature of the Pacific War and the deep hatred many Americans felt toward the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Contrasts with other theaters. The treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces can be better understood through comparison with prisoner experiences in other theaters of World War II and with the treatment of Allied prisoners by the Japanese. These contrasts illuminate the exceptional nature of American adherence to Geneva Convention standards in the Pacific. Allied prisoners held by Japanese forces endured horrific conditions that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. The death rate among Allied prisoners was appalling, with approximately 27% dying in Japanese captivity compared to about 4% in German captivity. Japanese authorities often argued they were not bound by Geneva Convention provisions, as Japan had signed, but never ratified, the agreement. Even beyond legal technicalities, Japanese military culture viewed surrender as shameful and treated captured enemies with contempt and cruelty. Allied prisoners of the Japanese faced starvation rations that led to widespread malnutrition diseases, brutal forced labor on projects like the Burma Railway where thousands died, inadequate medical care that left even minor injuries and illnesses potentially fatal, physical abuse including beatings and torture, and mass atrocities such as the Bataan Death March and the execution of prisoners. These experiences represented systematic disregard for prisoner welfare and basic human dignity. The contrast between Allied suffering in Japanese captivity and Japanese comfort in American captivity was stark, and sometimes caused resentment among American personnel who were aware of how their comrades were being treated. Camp guards who had friends or family members held in Japanese prisoner camps found it difficult to treat Japanese prisoners kindly while knowing about the abuse suffered by Allied prisoners. Military discipline and adherence to orders prevented most guards from acting on these feelings, but tensions existed. Prisoner treatment in the European theater differed from the Pacific experience in several ways. German treatment of Western Allied prisoners generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards, though there were violations and conditions were often harsh. Soviet prisoners held by Germany fared much worse, enduring conditions comparable to Japanese camps with extremely high mortality rates. American and British prisoners in German camps received Red Cross parcels that supplemented their rations and maintained better conditions than would otherwise have existed. The cultural context of European warfare included some degree of shared civilization and mutual respect between combatants, despite the terrible violence. The racial dimensions of the Pacific War created different dynamics. Many Japanese viewed Western Allied forces through the lens of racial superiority, seeing them as decadent and weak. Conversely, American propaganda often portrayed Japanese as subhuman or bestial, which could have justified poor treatment of prisoners. The fact that American authorities maintained Geneva Convention standards despite this propaganda testifies to the strength of institutional commitment to international law and military discipline. Repatriation and aftermath. As World War II drew to a close following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the process of repatriating Japanese prisoners began. This massive undertaking involved transporting tens of thousands of prisoners from camps scattered across the United States and Pacific territories back to a devastated Japan. The repatriation process revealed new dimensions of the prisoner experience and created lasting impacts that echoed through the post-war years. Planning for repatriation began before the war ended, as American authorities anticipated eventual victory and prepared for the disposition of enemy prisoners. The process was methodical and carefully organized. Prisoners were processed at their camps, receiving documentation of their captivity and medical examinations to ensure they were healthy enough for the journey. They were issued clothing for the return trip and provided with limited personal possessions they had accumulated during captivity. Transportation to Japan occurred via military vessels that had been converted for prisoner transport. The voyages across the Pacific took weeks and involved thousands of prisoners crowded aboard ships. Conditions during transport were adequate but not luxurious, as the priority was efficient mass movement rather than comfort. Despite the crowding, prisoners were provided sufficient food and medical care during the journeys. After years of good treatment in American camps, most prisoners did not complain about the temporary hardships of the voyage home. Arrival in Japan confronted returning prisoners with the reality of their nation defeat and the terrible devastation wrought by American bombing campaigns. Major cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered, food was scarce, and millions of Japanese faced uncertain futures. The contrast between the relative comfort of American captivity and the hardship awaiting them at home was jarring. Some prisoners reportedly felt reluctant to leave the camps where they had been well fed and safe, knowing they faced hunger and chaos upon return. The social reception awaiting returned prisoners was complex and often painful. Japanese culture and military tradition held that soldiers should die rather than surrender, making captured soldiers objects of shame and dishonor. Families sometimes rejected returned prisoners or treated them as dead. Communities could be hostile to men who had failed to uphold the warrior code. Some returnees found it difficult to reintegrate into society and struggled with employment and social relationships due to the stigma of captivity. However, not all returning prisoners faced rejection. The war, stories of Japanese prisoners in American camps became part of the historical record and contributed to understanding of World War II and its complexities. Oral histories collected from former prisoners provided valuable perspectives on the war experience. These accounts revealed the human dimensions of conflict and showed how individuals on both sides of the war struggled with moral ambiguities and unexpected situations. The treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces has been evaluated by historians as generally reflecting credit on the United States military and government. While not perfect and certainly complicated by the strategic motivations that partially drove humane policies, the adherence to Geneva Convention standards in the face of deep animosity and brutal warfare demonstrated institutional commitment to international law and basic human rights. This stands as one aspect of American World War II conduct that remains relatively uncontroversial and praiseworthy. Lessons and legacy. The experience of Japanese prisoners in American camps during World War II offers multiple lessons that remain relevant for understanding warfare, international relations, and human behavior under extreme circumstances. These lessons extend beyond the immediate historical context and inform contemporary debates about prisoner treatment, warfare ethics, and international humanitarian law. The demonstration that humane treatment of prisoners can serve strategic military purposes challenges simplistic assumptions about the incompatibility of ethics and effectiveness in warfare. The American approach in the Pacific showed that adhering to international standards and treating prisoners well could advance military objectives by encouraging surrender, gathering intelligence, and undermining enemy morale. This suggests that ethical conduct and strategic success are not necessarily in tension and can in fact reinforce each other. The role of institutional commitment to international law proved crucial in maintaining standards of treatment, despite emotional pressures and cultural prejudices that could have justified poor treatment of Japanese prisoners. Individual American soldiers and civilians often harbored deep hatred for the Japanese after Pearl Harbor and the brutal conduct of the Pacific War. However, military institutional culture and clear command emphasis on following Geneva Convention rules prevented this hatred from translating into systematic prisoner abuse. This highlights the importance of strong institutions and clear standards that can constrain individual impulses and maintain civilized conduct even in the midst of savage warfare. Cultural differences and misunderstandings created significant challenges in the prison camp context, but were not insurmountable barriers to humane treatment. American camp administrators had to learn about Japanese culture, values, and practices to effectively manage prisoner populations and respond to their needs. The willingness to accommodate cultural practices like Buddhist observances and traditional holidays demonstrated respect that helped maintain camp stability. This experience suggests that effective cross-cultural engagement is possible even between enemies in wartime if genuine effort is made. The psychological impact of unexpected kindness proved profound and lasting. Japanese prisoners who expected torture and death but instead received food, medical care, and reasonable treatment experienced cognitive dissonance that fundamentally altered their worldviews. Many came to question the propaganda they had been taught about American barbarity, and some became advocates for peace and reconciliation. This demonstrates the power of action to change minds more effectively than words alone could achieve. The contrast between American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners illustrates the real-world consequences of adherence to or disregard for international humanitarian standards. While Allied prisoners suffered terribly in Japanese camps, Japanese prisoners benefited from American compliance with the Geneva Convention. This asymmetry reveals both the moral challenges of maintaining high standards when your enemy does not reciprocate and the practical benefits that accrue to those who surrender to a power that respects international law. The long-term legacy of prisoner treatment in the Pacific Theater contributed to post-war Japanese-American relations and the broader reconciliation between former enemies. The fact that Japanese prisoners were treated well made it easier for Japan and the United States to move past wartime enmity and develop the alliance that has lasted for decades. Veterans who experienced American kindness in captivity could serve as witnesses to American character and could help counter lingering wartime propaganda in Japanese society. While many factors contributed to successful post-war reconciliation, the treatment of prisoners played a supporting role. Contemporary debates about terrorism, unlawful combatants, and interrogation techniques sometimes reference World War II experiences as historical precedents. The Japanese prisoner experience shows that valuable intelligence can be obtained through humane treatment, and that following international standards does not necessarily impede military effectiveness. These lessons remain contested in current policy debates, but provide historical evidence for those arguing that maintaining high standards serves both moral and practical purposes. The enduring relevance of the Japanese prisoner story lies partly in its demonstration of humanity persisting amid inhumanity. World War II was characterized by terrible atrocities and suffering on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Within this context of industrial-scale killing and brutality, the relatively humane treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces stands as evidence that civilized conduct remained possible even in extremis. This offers some grounds for hope that international humanitarian law and basic decency can survive even the most terrible conflicts. For the individuals who experienced captivity in American camps, the memories remained vivid throughout their lives. The taste